High above Manhattan, where the skyscrapers seem to reach the clouds and the offices are buzzing with ambition, everything feels like it's running like a well-oiled machine. Every little detail is carefully managed and decisions are made with precision. But sometimes all it takes is one unexpected person to throw a wrench in the works. Just a single presence with subtle moves and an intense stare can change everything. In a world where power and control are everything, even the tiniest disruption can lead to changes that no one sees coming until it's too late. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. The sound of heels clicked on the shiny marble floor as Samantha Grace walked through the huge lobby of Langston Tower. You couldn't miss her. She was tall and slender, with dark brown hair pulled back into a perfect bun and a tailored suit that showed off her natural elegance. She radiated confidence even with security guards and receptionists keeping an eye on her. On the 48th floor, Davis Langford, the billionaire owner of Langston Enterprises, was absorbed in a spreadsheet on his massive screen at 43. Davis Langford was a commanding figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and sharply featured. He looked the part of a successful businessman, but had a vibe that kept his employees a bit on edge. "Mr. Langston," said Megan, his longtime assistant, walking in without knocking, "your new secretary has arrived." Samantha Gray Davis Langford didn't look up right away. "Send her in," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. When Samantha walked in, Davis Langford couldn't help but look up. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but it definitely wasn't this. She was more than just beautiful. There was something magnetic about her. Her sharp eyes seemed to see right through the surface, and her confident demeanor made it clear she wasn't easily rattled. "Mr. Langston," she said, extending her hand, "it's a pleasure to meet you." Davis Langford shook her hand, noting how firm it was. "Welcome, Ms. Gray. I hope you're ready for some intense work." "I always am," she replied with a professional smile. Davis Langford tilted his head, sizing her up for a moment before getting back to business. "Megan will show you the ropes, but I expect quick results. I have little patience for incompetence." "Neither do I," Samantha shot back without missing a beat before heading to her new desk. As she walked away, Davis Langford felt something unexpected. It wasn't just a physical attraction, something he rarely allowed himself to feel, but a spark of curiosity. Throughout the day, he caught glimpses of Samantha out of the corner of his eye, trying not to make it obvious. She was incredibly efficient, fitting right into the fast-paced environment like she'd been there forever. When he handed her a complicated financial report, expecting it to take her ages to review, he was surprised when she returned it in less than 30 minutes, complete with corrections and suggestions that really impressed him. "You adjusted the projections?" he asked, flipping through the pages with interest. "Yes, sir. The margins were underestimated. I updated them based on the latest data." Davis Langford raised an eyebrow. "You're good." "I know," she replied with a slight smile that hinted at humor. Later, during an impromptu meeting with the marketing team, she made a comment that left the other executives completely stunned. "Hey, if we push the launch to the beginning of next quarter, we could grab a bigger piece of the emerging market," she suggested casually. "You've already looked into the emerging market data, right?" one of the managers asked, surprised. "Yeah, I thought it might be useful," she replied. Davis Langford, sitting at the head of the table, stayed quiet, but inside he felt a strange restlessness. Samantha Gray wasn't just a competent secretary, she was sharp, strategic, and a bit unpredictable. When the clock hit 7, the office started to clear out. Davis Langford was still at his desk, like usual. To his surprise, Samantha was still there too. He stepped out of his office and saw her going through documents with a focus that caught his attention. "You don't have to stay so late," he said, leaning against his office door. "I know," she replied without looking up, "but I'd rather get ahead." Davis Langford smiled, which was rare for him. "Do you have something to prove?" he asked. She looked up and there was a challenge in her gaze. "Always." Davis Langford went back to his office but couldn't concentrate. He stared out the window at the lit-up city and, for the first time in years, found himself genuinely intrigued by someone. Samantha Gray wasn't what he had expected, and maybe that was what threw him off the most. "Who are you?" he murmured to himself as the city lights twinkled outside. In the meeting room, Davis Langford wasn't focused on the multi-million-dollar contract his lawyers were discussing. Instead, his thoughts were on Samantha Gray. It wasn't just her looks that caught his eye, although that was hard to ignore, but the way she seemed to know what he needed before he even asked. She was all business, but there was something about her that he just couldn't figure out. He couldn't avoid it any longer. He needed to know more. After dismissing the team, he went back to his office and shut the door. Picking up his phone, he called a discreet contact he had used before for sensitive matters. "Paul, I need something simple," he said, getting straight to the point. "I'm listening," came the gravelly voice on the other end. "I want you to look into someone, Samantha Gray. She works for me. Find out everything, where she lives, who she hangs out with, if there's anyone in her life. I need to know if she's single." Paul hesitated for a moment but kept his tone neutral. "Got it. I'll get back to you with a report soon." Davis Langford hung up and let out a deep breath. He knew it was risky, but he told himself it was just precautionary. He didn't want to cross any lines with Samantha until he knew more about her. In the following days, Davis Langford tried to keep it together at work, but every interaction with Samantha only made him more curious. She was flawless, always on time, super efficient, and never made a mistake. It was like she was made for this job, but she never shared anything personal. Finally, Paul called back with what he'd dug up. "You won't believe this," he said, chuckling a bit. Davis Langford felt a slight tightening in his chest. "Talk to me." "She's like a social ghost. No social media presence, no visible friends. She leaves the office, goes home, and works more. It's like her life is all about her job. I followed her for 3 nights. Nothing. Not even a casual dinner with friends, just work meetings and grocery runs." Davis Langford raised an eyebrow. "Nothing. No dates, no boyfriend, nothing?" "Exactly. It's like her whole world is about being the perfect secretary." Davis Langford was quiet for a moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. It felt good and weird. How could someone like Samantha not have a life outside of work? "Keep digging," he said, ending the call. In the days that followed, Davis Langford started noticing things he had missed before. How she kept a strict yet polite distance. How she answered every question precisely but never shared more than needed. And most importantly, how she always seemed to be a step ahead, like she could read his mind. One afternoon, he called her into his office. "Mr. Langston," Samantha said as she walked in, holding a folder of contracts. Davis Langford motioned for her to take a seat. "Have you ever thought about stepping up to a bigger role, like operations manager?" Davis Langford asked. Samantha blinked, caught off guard, but quickly got herself together. "My current job is good for me," she replied. Davis Langford leaned in, really studying her. "You're amazing, Samantha. You could totally do more than just being a secretary." "Thanks," she said with a polite smile, "but I like being here. I feel useful and my work makes me happy." Davis Langford couldn't help but smile faintly. Samantha was like a fortress. The more he tried to figure her out, the more unapproachable she seemed, and that only fueled his curiosity. Later that day, he got another call from Paul. "Nothing new," Paul said. "Either she's really good at hiding stuff or there's nothing to hide." Davis Langford hung up without saying anything, but he just couldn't shake the feeling that Samantha wasn't that straightforward. What was she hiding? And why couldn't he stop thinking about her? The clock read 9:30 p.m., and it was especially quiet on the 48th floor of Langston Tower. The city lights twinkled through the big windows. The building was almost empty, except for Davis Langford and Samantha, who were still working on an important report for an international client. But Davis Langford couldn't concentrate. His eyes kept drifting to Samantha, sitting at her desk, going through documents with a focus that was almost mesmerizing. The way she adjusted her glasses or touched her pen to her lips, while thinking sent his mind spiraling into places he knew he shouldn't go. He had been trying to fight it for weeks, but at that moment, he decided to take a chance. Married or not, he had to find out if there was something between them. He got up and walked slowly toward her. She looked up, a bit surprised but not scared. "You always go above and beyond," he said, trying to keep his voice steady but letting a bit of something else slip through. "It's what's expected of me," she replied with a soft, professional smile. Davis Langford moved a bit closer, leaning on her desk. "And what do you expect from all this, from your life?" he asked. She paused as if picking her words carefully. "I expect to do my job well. That's enough for me." Davis Langford opened his mouth to say more, but just then his phone rang. He cursed under his breath at the interruption. When he saw Paul's name, irritation mixed with curiosity. "One moment," he said to Samantha, grabbing his phone and turning his back to her. "Paul," he answered, trying to hide his annoyance. "This isn't a good time, Davis Langford." Paul's voice was urgent yet amused. "You won't believe this." Davis Langford frowned. "What?" "Samantha. I saw her having dinner with your wife." Davis Langford's world seemed to freeze. He pressed the phone tighter against his ear, sure he must have misheard. "With my wife?" "Yeah. Last night at a quiet restaurant on the Upper East Side. They were chatting like old friends, laughing." None of it made sense. Davis Langford was silent, his heart racing. Why would Samantha be having dinner with his wife? And what did it mean? "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his tone almost hostile. "Absolutely. I've got photos if you want them." Davis Langford hung up abruptly, his face a mix of confusion and anger. He looked at Samantha, who was still calmly sitting at her desk, seemingly unaware of his call. She raised her eyes and smiled. "Is something wrong, Mr. Langston?" she asked gently. Davis Langford forced a smile, feeling dizzy from his obsession and the new revelation. "Nothing that can't wait." As he returned to his desk, unable to face her directly, one question pounded in his mind. What were Samantha Gray and his wife up to? The next morning started like any other. Samantha showed up on time, looking sharp and standing tall. But there was something different about her. Davis Langford could feel it the moment she walked in to drop off the day's reports. She seemed lighter, more confident than usual. Davis Langford, on the other hand, was restless. The night's revelation still echoed in his mind. He didn't know what Samantha and his wife might be scheming, if anything at all, but it definitely complicated his feelings for her. When Samantha came into his office mid-morning with a folder of contracts, Davis Langford tried to keep it together. "Mr. Langston," she started, placing the folder on his desk. "These are the documents for review." "Thanks," he replied, avoiding eye contact, but Samantha didn't leave right away. She stood there, watching him with an intriguing look. "You seem distracted today." Davis Langford finally met her gaze. "Just another busy day, a lot on my mind." Samantha leaned in a bit, resting her hands on his desk. "Is there anything I can help with?" Davis Langford was feeling the pressure in the room. Samantha's words were sneaky but clear. He could feel the tension between them ramping up. She was definitely testing him, and for a second he almost gave in. Part of him wanted to, but the part that remembered Paul's call kept him in check. "I appreciate your hard work," he said, picking his words carefully. Samantha smiled but didn't back off. Instead, she walked around the desk, getting closer. "Mr. Langston," she said, her tone a mix of respect and something more personal. "I know I put in the effort, but I also see when there's something else going on." Davis Langford froze. That was exactly what he feared and secretly wanted. Samantha was stepping over the line just like he had almost done the night before. "Miss Gray," he started, trying to keep his voice steady but firm, "I want to remind you that I'm a married man." Samantha's smile didn't fade. She took a step back, crossed her arms, and tilted her head, sizing him up. "Of course," she said with a light laugh. "I just meant that your dedication is impressive. I didn't mean to come off as inappropriate." Davis Langford narrowed his eyes. She had pulled back, but the game was still very much alive. Samantha had a knack for blurring the lines between professional and personal, and he couldn't tell how much of it was planned. "Good," he said, standing up to put some space between them. "Now, if you could get back to your work, I have a lot to do." "Sure," Samantha replied, her expression neutral. But as she walked out, Davis Langford noticed something in her eyes. There was no embarrassment or regret, just a hint of triumph. Once she closed the door, he slumped back in his chair, rubbing his face. He knew he did the right thing by stepping back, but he also felt like this wasn't over. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being toyed with. Who was Samantha Gray, really? And what did she want from him? Davis Langford parked his car in front of his Upper East Side mansion. The place looked inviting with its pristine exterior and warm lights shining from inside, but tonight there was a weird tension in the air as he walked in. The soft sound of a piano floated through the house, and the smell of dinner wafted around. He heard light footsteps coming down the stairs, and there was his wife, Evelyn, with a big smile. "Good evening, darling," she said, gliding over like a hostess at a fancy dinner. She was dressed in a sleek black dress with pearls that sparkled in the soft light. It was unusual to see her so dressed up without a special reason. "Good evening," Davis Langford replied, trying to keep it casual. Evelyn kissed him on the cheek, a warm gesture that felt a little too calculated. "You're just in time. I made your favorite dish." He raised an eyebrow. Evelyn hardly ever cooked, especially not without a reason. Usually their evenings were all about social events or meals made by the staff. This whole setup felt unexpected. They moved to the dining room and the table was perfectly set with tall candles and shiny silverware catching the light from the chandelier. Davis Langford sat down watching her pour the wine. Her movements were smooth, almost like she was trying to send a message without saying anything. Evelyn sat across from him, resting her elbows on the table casually. "How was your day at work?" she asked, her voice sounding curious but rehearsed. Davis Langford hesitated before answering. "Busy, as always." "I can imagine," she said, taking a sip of her wine. "And how's your new secretary? Samantha, right?" Davis Langford felt a little tightening in his chest, but kept his face neutral. Competent, very efficient. "Why do you ask?" Evelyn smiled, a smile that seemed to hold secrets. "Just curious. Megan mentioned you seemed pleased with her selection. It's good to hear she's doing well." Davis Langford nodded slowly, studying his wife's face. Evelyn was smart, a natural strategist, and he knew she never acted without a reason. She was onto something but was waiting for him to spill it first. The dinner went on with some light conversation, but Davis Langford picked up on subtle gestures and comments that confirmed his hunch. Evelyn was giving him an unusual amount of attention, almost like she was rewarding him for something. Later, as they lounged in the living room, Evelyn sat next to him on the sofa and turned to face him. Her eyes had that calculated glint that always fascinated and unsettled him. "You seem tense," she said lightly, running her fingers along his arm. "Long day," he replied, looking away. Evelyn smiled again, this time almost like a mother. "Davis Langford, you know you can trust me, right?" "Of course," he said automatically. She leaned in and planted a soft kiss on his forehead before getting up. Good, because I trust you. Davis Langford stayed seated, frozen in thought as Evelyn went up the stairs, leaving him alone. He knew he had been tested, and from her behavior it seemed he had passed. The Manhattan sky was clear that morning, a rare moment of calm in a city that never stops. Davis Langford walked into Langston Tower with his usual confident and calculating demeanor. The revelations of the past few days still echoed in his mind, but he knew control was back in his hands. Once he reached his office, he dropped his briefcase on the desk, adjusted his watch, and picked up the phone. He dialed Paul's number, listening to the rings as he settled into his leather chair. "Paul," he said as soon as the man picked up, "congratulations on your efficiency." On the other end, Paul chuckled, a bit caught off guard. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. It was a pleasure to assist you." Davis Langford leaned forward, a faint smile creeping up. "Have you checked your bank account today?" There was a brief silence followed by a nervous laugh. "Not yet, but I'll do that right now." "Do that. Good work." He hung up before Paul could say more, already imagining the guy's reaction when he saw the generous bonus in his account. Rewarding loyalty and efficiency was just as crucial as punishing betrayal. The rest of the day moved like clockwork. Davis Langford dove into meetings and contract reviews, but made sure to treat Samantha Gray with the utmost professionalism. No lingering looks, no chats that went beyond what was necessary. "Mr. Langston," Samantha said at the end of a presentation, "is there anything else you need from me today?" He glanced at her briefly, sizing her up. Samantha was skilled and enigmatic, but right now she was just another piece on his chessboard. "No, Ms. Gray," he replied firmly but politely. "Your work is excellent. Keep it up." She smiled faintly, maybe expecting something more, but he had already turned back to the papers in front of him. The day wrapped up without any major events. As Davis Langford rode the elevator down to leave, he reflected on how everything had played out. Evelyn had tested him. He was sure of that. Samantha was the piece chosen to gauge his fidelity, and he had played the game like a pro. When he got home that night, Evelyn greeted him with her usual warm smile. But this time, Davis Langford was deep in thought. Why did she feel the need to test him? Did she not trust him? The discomfort hit him hard. The idea that his own wife doubted his loyalty bothered him almost to the point of anger. For a moment, he thought about confronting her, but that idea faded quickly. How could he tell Evelyn that he knew about her friendship with Samantha? Because he had done a little digging into his secretary's private life. The irony of the whole situation was bitter. Maybe it was just a reflection of her insecurity. Being honest with himself, he knew he had given her reasons to feel that way in the past. Then something clicked in his mind. He looked at Evelyn again, noticing her smile seemed more genuine than ever, her gaze softer. Instead of fixating on why she had tested him, maybe it was smarter to recognize what was in front of him. Evelyn loved him, and the best move would be to reciprocate that love. Davis Langford took a sip of whiskey, letting the warmth of the drink help him sort out his thoughts. He had almost made a mistake, but hadn't. Now he realized that in life you don't always need to mess up to learn the important lessons. He thought about what he could have lost: his wife, his reputation, and most importantly, his self-respect. These things were his foundation, the essence of who he was. The best way forward, he decided, was to stop looking for explanations and just accept that the moment of doubt had passed. More importantly, he realized that his marriage and the bond they shared were strong enough to be restored and strengthened through small gestures of understanding and dedication. Looking at Evelyn, he felt a wave of peace. What mattered now wasn't the test, but the love that still connected them. For Davis Langford, the real win was in reinforcing that connection, valuing what they had, and moving forward together toward a stronger, more harmonious future. What do you think of Davis Langford? Would you have played the game differently? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. More great stories are on the way.